Welcome to the IISS. Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Matthew Harries. I'm Managing Editor of Survival and Senior Fellow for Transatlantic Affairs and Nuclear Policy. Our event today is titled Understanding the US Nuclear Posture Review. The report of the NPR was released a week today, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Kori Schake, Deputy Director General of the IISS. As many of you already know, Kori has had a distinguished career as a scholar and practitioner in defense and international affairs. Her time in the US government has included service in the White House, in the Department of Defense, and the State Department, where she ended up as Deputy Director for Policy Planning. Her most recent book, published in 2017, is titled Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony. And in 2016, she co-edited a book on US civil-military relations with James Mattis, who, of course, went on to become Secretary of Defense. She joined the IISS at the beginning of this month, a week ago, from the Hoover Institution at Stanford, where she was a distinguished research fellow. And I'm pleased to say that this is her first public event since becoming Deputy Director. So, Kori, welcome again to London, and thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
I am so happy to be here and be part of John Shipman's terrific IISS team. And I also want to thank all of you for showing up today, because your participation is the intellectual lifeblood of this organization. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Tell me what you want us to do better. Tell me what you want us to do more of. I work for all of you in addition to working for John.
Fantastic. Okay, so we are on the record. We are being filmed, and the video will be available later on the IISS website. I'll ask Kori some questions for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor for a broader discussion. So, Kori, back in December 2016, which seems like a lifetime ago, President-elect Trump tweeted, "The United States must greatly strengthen and expand its nuclear capability until such time as the world comes to its senses regarding nukes." And when he was asked about this later and whether it risked starting an arms race, he reportedly said, "Let it be an arms race. We will outmatch them at every pass and outlast them all." So my first question to you, Kori, is, does this NPR give the president what he asked for?
It gives him some of what he asked for. It does strengthen the nuclear enterprise in the United States. It does acknowledge that the international security situation is deteriorating, largely because of Russia's very aggressive moves in modernization, in operations, in nuclear doctrine. It does restart nuclear production in the United States. It would create a near-term expansion of the submarine-launched ballistic missile force in order to have a lower-yield warhead. And it does envision a submarine-launched cruise missile as a longer-term possibility. So there are differences there. It does fully fund the nuclear enterprise, the NNSA, which the Nuclear Posture Review says criticizes the Obama administration for having underfunded for years and years. So I do think it fully intends to strengthen nuclear deterrence, to fill in some emergent gaps in the escalatory ladder. It does think seriously about how our nuclear and conventional forces work together. I think it goes a long way to do what the president suggested. What it does not do, however, it does not substantially expand the American nuclear force quantitatively, and it does remain compliant with all nuclear arms control agreements the United States is party to. And I think those are important things that the president might not have intended, but that are true about the nuclear posture review and the force structure it envisions.
Okay, so let's dig into the question of the escalatory ladder and deterrence gaps. So one of the key themes of this NPR is the idea of flexibility. And you mentioned that the NPR characterizes Russia's attitude towards nuclear weapons as troubling in a particular way. And the idea, very roughly speaking, is that Russia, according to the NPR, has developed a mistaken belief that it could coerce the United States out of a conflict by limited nuclear use, or the threat of limited nuclear use. And that is a principal rationale for the low-yield warhead on submarine-launched ballistic missiles and the future nuclear cruise missile, sea-launched cruise missile. So my question is, do you think the NPR gets it right about Russia? Is that actually how Russia thinks about nuclear use? And then, if your answer to that is generally yes, are these the right answers to those problems?
So there are at least 15 people in this room better qualified to answer the question about Russia than I am qualified to answer the question about Russia. It does seem to me, though, that the drumbeat of treaty violations by the Russians, of aggressive modernization by the Russians, of invading their neighbors, of large-scale exercises that envision nuclear weapons use against NATO states, and of doctrinal statements about early low-yield nuclear use in order to prevent effective response, effective defense of the West by the NATO countries. It's not unreasonable to think that we ought to be bringing the changes a little bit and thinking about whether our strategy and our forces and our alliance engagements are up to the task of the first purpose of nuclear forces, which is deterring aggression on the part of the Russians. So I don't think they're wrong to consider it. Do I think this is the right answer? Let me put it differently. My read of the Nuclear Posture Review is that the proposal for the SLBM, SLCM, the low-yield option, actually had three motivations. First, concern about the ability to penetrate Russian air defenses. Second, concern about the spectrum of escalation, like having a fluid potential for escalation in order to deter. But the third thing also, it was striking to me how strongly the contingent nature of it was, both in the NPR itself and in Secretary Mattis's testimony to Congress about it since it was released, which was, if the Russians come back into compliance with the INF Treaty, if the Russians stop being a danger to NATO allies, that is the conditions on which it's clearly a bargaining chip to try and induce the Russians back into less threatening behavior. And that, I think, is consistent with the overall effect. I was struck when I was reading the Nuclear Posture Review at how much the national defense strategy is focused on China, but the Nuclear Posture Review is focused on Russia. And so they're clearly both saying we need to rethink the enterprise because of Russia's behavior and trying to incentivize different behavior on Russia's part. And if I were a betting man, I would bet that if the Russians stop being such a danger to the U.S. and its allies, that the low-yield option will be quickly traded away.
Interesting. Two questions about the bargaining chip thing. One is that the NPR does talk about the sea-launched cruise missile in the context of China as well, and it even it makes reference to the fact that the US previously had a nuclear cruise missile on submarines, the TLAM-N, which was withdrawn in the 2010 NPR, and that there's an implicit criticism because this NPR says that had for decades provided deterrence and assurance in East Asia. So how can you have a bargaining chip vis-a-vis Russia, which you think is useful vis-a-vis China?
Because there are things you want it more and less for, right? We'd be willing to sustain that vulnerability. My guess is the United States would be willing to sustain or find alternative ways to manage that vulnerability vis-a-vis China in order to get the Russians, who are the principal concern because of their behavior, that is driving the reposture.
Okay. Let's talk about the allies for a bit. So the NPR talks about the role that US nuclear weapons should play in assuring allies. Let's start with Europe. In the European context, how do you think this NPR is going to go down with European NATO allies?
So because deep in my heart I am an insurance actuary, I actually counted the number of times allies or alliance obligations are mentioned in the NPR. Anybody care to take a guess at what the overall number is? Come on, come on, come on. Somebody take a guess. 127 mentions of allies and alliance obligations, 5 of them in the Secretary of Defense's 2-page cover letter to it, right? And it talks about the way that American warfighting exists in tight webbing with both our responsibilities to our allies, with our extended nuclear deterrence, and with the spectrum of conventional to nuclear. So they are clearly sending a message on that. Second thing I noticed when I was reading it about allies is, it identifies the 4 major purposes that nuclear forces perform. Deterrence, allied reassurance is number 2. Even before the capacity to blunt attack, right? So the allied piece of this is essential. I did also notice more nuance, but it also comes through that the reason they chose submarine basing was that it required no allied support for it. So they clearly don't think this is a replay of the early 1980s deployments. They understand what pressure that would put on alliance relations, given concerns about where the United States is heading right now.
And on that topic, so that was an excellent supply side answer to the question, and I believe you that the Secretary of Defense is intensely committed to the US alliances, and I also believe, from what I can see from the document, that alliance is a big theme in the document. But that's a different thing from how it will actually function in terms of assurance. And in the mindset of European allies, who do you think is going to welcome this, and who do you think is going to be more concerned about, potential expansion of nuclear role and so on?
Well, I think it will cut along the traditional allied lines, right? That Britain and France and perhaps some of NATO's newer members will welcome it. I think the new German Foreign Secretary might not be enthusiastic about it. And it'll fall the way it traditionally falls among NATO allies. But I do also think that a United States that is being clear about the nature of the challenges it sees and clear about our willingness to shoulder effective responses to those challenges also creates an ecosystem where allies, even if they're anxious about what we might do, are also still glad we're doing it.
Right. And in terms of the concept of flexibility and the escalation ladder and so on, the thing that struck me was that in 2016 at the Warsaw NATO summit, one of the big victories for people who are interested in deterrence was this language that any use of nuclear weapons would fundamentally alter the nature of a conflict. That you cannot, if Russia believes that it could use nuclear weapons in a limited way, that's not going to work. What I worry about is, doesn't bringing in additional limited options to the US arsenal in a way undercut that message? I mean, are we wrong to think that any use would fundamentally change the nature of a conflict?
No, you're not wrong to think that any nuclear use would fundamentally change the conflict. But that's also completely consistent with what the NPS says and with what the Secretary of Defense has testified subsequently. Right? There's no such thing as a non-strategic nuclear weapon. That said, you still strengthen deterrence by having no fire breaks in capability or no no perception on the part of your adversaries that they can force a pause that will cause you not to achieve your objectives, which in the case of the NATO allies is protecting the territory and populations of the NATO countries.
Okay.
I actually don't, I read it differently than you do on that. I actually think it ought to be quite a reassuring message, and that the United States understands that we are one of the main beneficiaries of the taboo on nuclear use, as Tom Schelling always reminded us all, right? Because we have the capacity to win our conventional wars if we should choose to. And so the nuclear threshold reinforces that comparative advantage that we, the NATO countries and the US in particular, have. One of the things that I think is a continuity, though, in the National Defense Strategy and also in the Nuclear Posture Review, I think I read intonations of less confidence about our ability to win our conventional wars in both of those documents. I think the search for more flexible means of response is just like in the Kennedy administration, or just like the Soviets in the 1970s, when you begin to have doubts that you can achieve your objectives by conventional force, you start to think about how can our nuclear arsenal be more useful in that regard.
Speaking of doubts about conventional forces, let's move further east, and talk about China. Another major theme of the NPR is the idea of tailored deterrence, that you have a one-size-fits-all deterrence strategy doesn't work, you need different strategies for different adversaries. What do you see as the main deterrence problem vis-a-vis China, and how far do you think this NPR goes towards addressing that problem?
I think the main deterrent problem where China is concerned is the small incremental, what I think of as kind of threshold warfare, and operating enough below the creation of islands, the putting of airstrips on those islands, the deployments of forces on those islands, right? It's the lobster boiling strategy, where you do just enough that an American response would seem, or an Allied response more importantly, would seem out of proportion to the challenge. That I view as the main deterrent challenge from the Chinese. And no, I don't think anything in Nuclear Posture Review addresses that, but I do think the administration is, with routine freedom of navigation patrols and things like that, and strengthening the hand and the cooperation of us and our regional allies to prevent the Chinese from changing facts on the water in the South and East China Seas, and in ways that alarm our allies in Asia.
And on the North Korea question, do you see anything in this document that gives us clues about where the administration is on North Korea? I mean, you've written eloquently about the dangers of a preventive strike on North Korea. Is there anything in here that gives us a sense of where the administration is, or is this a separate question?
I don't think it tells us anything new about where the administration is. It reiterates the Defense Department's long-standing view. By long-standing, I mean since 1953. That any attack by North Korea on the United States or its allies would result in a military retaliation by the United States that the leadership of North Korea would not survive. Right? We have had a fundamentally asymmetric strategy with regard to the North Koreans for a very long time. I personally believe it's the right strategy. That is, it targets the only thing that it's clear to me that the North Korean regime values, which is the North Korean regime. And it is retaliatory in its threat. The Australians, Japanese, and South Korean governments have all said publicly that they are not on board for a preventative war against North Korea. It seems to me disastrous to America's interests throughout the world to prosecute a war in order to reduce a risk to us that voluntarily incurs such enormous potential damage to our allies when those allies don't support the fighting level. However, that does not appear to be the White House's position. The National Security Advisor has said several times that the North Koreans aren't deterrable, and has said several times that the sand is running through the hourglass, and that's fundamentally inconsistent with the view on the Defense Department's part that the right threat is asymmetric and is insensitive to North Korea's nuclear status, or the position of the State Department, which is that sanctions can work, are work, that is, North Korea is deterrable, and with time that noose is tightening around the North Korean capacity to continue to make the choices that they're making. So I do think the President and the National Security Advisor are talking not just a stronger line than the departments are, but an actual different policy than the other departments are.
Speaking personally, I hope the other departments win. Let's talk about you mentioned in the first answer you gave, you talked about the non-nuclear aspects of deterrence. And a very strong theme in this NPR is the overlap between deterring nuclear attack and what the NPR calls non-nuclear strategic attack. And it has quite an expansive definition of what non-nuclear strategic attack might mean, and according to the New York Times at least, it might potentially include cyber attacks, specifically on population and infrastructure.
Right.
So the diagnosis actually seems to me reasonable. There is an increasing overlap between what advanced conventional or what advanced non-nuclear attacks can do and the role that nuclear weapons have traditionally played. But is nuclear retaliation a credible threat to deter non-nuclear strategic attack?
I don't know, is the honest answer. What I notice about those parts of the NPR are that it's one place where our lack of confidence about our conventional capabilities comes to the fore. The second thing that struck me about that kind of language is how much it sounds like the Bush administration in 2001 and 2002, when terrorism came bulking to the fore of our concerns and trying to grapple with, are terrorists deterrable? If so, how? What is the nature of the attribution challenge? What are our means? Right, the language in the NPR about cyber parallels very strongly, and what that suggests to me is that we don't have a good answer to the cyber challenge. We are trying to put it in the context of deterrent means we currently have, and we're hoping for the best.
Okay, let's talk about Congress briefly. I'm sure your favorite topic, and the Secretary of Defense's favorite topic as well. The Obama administration went through a big battle.
I'm sorry, another thing I should have said on the previous one, which is that language on nuclear asymmetric, nuclear being applicable to cyber is actually not new in this NPR. The Obama administration was grappling with the same problem in similar terms.
And the thing I always wonder is how big would the level of effect and instant speed of effect of a cyber attack would presumably have to be pretty high to replicate anything close to nuclear attack, right? So can you imagine circumstances in which nuclear response would be reasonable?
Oh, sure, but I have a particularly grisly imagination.
Okay.
Right? Disabling all the dams of the United States and creating, right, causing nuclear power plants that rely on water-cooled cores or rods. Yeah, I can think of all sorts of horrible things.
Okay, I'm going to sleep a bit worse tonight. Thank you for that.
You did ask.
Yeah, I did ask. It's my own fault. Okay, Congress. So the Obama administration worked hard, had a big battle to create a consensus around modernization of the whole US nuclear enterprise. There are some parts of this NPR which are going to cause controversy. Do you think that any of that controversy risks the consensus that was already built around the existing modernization plan?
So I am less confident than you that there was a congressional consensus as opposed to refusal by Republicans to support the New START treaty unless President Obama reluctantly and only half-heartedly in implementation committed to the stabilization of the stockpile and the nuclear enterprise. There's a fair amount of suspicion on the part of Republicans in Congress that enough has been done. I think that's one of the shots across the bow that the Nuclear Posture Review fires, which is that the Obama administration actually didn't fund the nuclear sustainment in the way they had promised Congress. So I don't think there's a congressional consensus. I think there's a Mexican standoff on this issue. And I think the Nuclear Posture Review does a reasonably good job of trying to explain what's different from 2010 to now. And two of the important points that they make, one we've already talked about, Russia's behavior, but the other is the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review was predicated on the notion that if the United States behaved virtuously in limiting and drawing down our nuclear forces, that would precipitate similar behavior on the part of other countries with nuclear arsenals and nuclear ambitions. And one of the things the Nuclear Posture Review says very clearly is no other nuclear state has responded virtuously in response to virtuous behavior by the United States. So they actually don't buy the argument that the United States reducing its arsenal will create a virtuous circle of others doing so. And that's another thing that they emphasize is different about this.
I can't resist then asking you, if they didn't follow the US into a virtuous circle, do you think they'll follow the US now down on a path of adding capabilities?
As astonishing as it may seem, Matthew, I do not believe every country's behavior is referential to what the United States does. It's not at all clear to me that most threshold states are making their choices in regard to the careful calibration of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, so much about their regional concerns, their existential concerns, drives countries to want nuclear weapons and to style their forces. A lot of that has absolutely nothing to do with us.
Okay. And one last question before we open this up about costs. So the US is going to have to modernize pretty much every part of the nuclear enterprise over the next 30 years, some of it all at the same time. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that the Obama modernization plan would cost $1.2 trillion over the next 30 years. Presumably the Trump administration plan will cost at least as much, if not more. Can the United States afford all of this?
Yes. Yes, and easily. Right? The defense authorization bill that passed was $708 billion for this year alone. $1.2 trillion over 30 years is actually not a lot of money where the American defense budget is concerned. So the nuclear force and its operations, that is the day-to-day maintenance of it, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines who are involved in the enterprise, the equipment, all of that is roughly 10% of the American defense budget. And as the Nuclear Posture Review says, and as the Secretary of Defense has repeatedly said, our nuclear deterrent is the central priority of the American defense enterprise. So if on 10% of your total spending, you can't afford your top priority, you're not doing it right.
Right, you are. Okay, let's open it up to questions from the floor. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Please introduce yourself before you ask the question, and please wait for one of the microphones to reach you. I think I can see Jonathan Marcus in the middle there.
Sharpshooter first off.
Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. Jonathan Marcus, BBC World Service. When we talk about nuclear arsenals, we focus on warheads and delivery systems. Obviously, another very important element is the whole early warning and command and control aspect. This nuclear posture review does set in train some significant modernization there. But since one of the great concerns is that this is the very part that is most vulnerable to cyber attack or anti-satellite weapons or a whole array of new technologies, do you think enough attention is being given to the modernization of command and control? And what more do you think, or how vulnerable do you think this is in the overall picture?
So that's a fantastic question. My read of the nuclear posture review is that they have a fire lit underneath them about the vulnerability of the NC3C systems, and this is where cyber comes home to roost. For those of you who didn't see the article maybe 6 months ago about some of America's nuclear systems operating on 1980s vintage floppy disks plug-in, hilariously enough, that turns out to be actually beneficial because it's a lot harder for them to be cyber vulnerable in that regard. So weirdly, Bismarck's comment about God having a special providence for drunks, babies, and the United States of America may prove true in this element as well. To take your question deadly seriously, though, that is hugely important. That is the element that is most vulnerable to cyber. And my read about the nuclear posture review is that they're really nervous about it and want to move very fast and very robustly to make sure that there's resilient command and control.
Gentleman in the second row on the left.
Thank you. Lee Willett, former RUSI person, former James person, now work for myself and used to write quite a lot about Tomahawk. Question to do with the bargaining chip point that you made and that has been so very detailed in a high-profile way in the review. When the US had nuclear Tomahawk first time around, there was a view that it was a bargaining chip more than anything else. But at the time, it was an existing system that worked well, and the US therefore had some leverage with it. At this moment, one can make an argument that Russia holds the cards because it has the in-service systems. It's the one that's rattling everyone's trees and cages and stuff. And the US has said that if we develop the system, we won't develop the system if you stop what you're doing. But then in the same document says, we'll develop the system in the longer term, we use existing technologies that are here already but maybe outdated in the longer term, and there aren't that many credible systems that you can think about that it could do in a cost-effective and affordable manner. How likely is it that the Russians will see a need to actually respond to this, given that they'll look at it and say, well, what have you got? You have no cards in your hand.
I take your point that future systems that may not be as cutting edge as existing Russian systems are relatively weak bargaining chip, but they're better than no bargaining chip, which is where we were before the nuclear posture review.
Thank you. Heather Williams in the second row.
Oh, no.
Thanks. Heather Williams from King's College London. I wanted to pick up on your comment about this non-existent virtuous circle. The NPR and the National Security Strategy give this impression that the United States has been taken advantage of, and that while the previous administration worked to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons and was committed to arms control, that others, such as Russia and China, saw that as a wavering commitment, and they saw it as an opportunity to build up. So for lack of a better phrase, it was kindness mistaken as weakness. So I'm wondering, do you think that the U.S. was taken advantage of in the previous administration? And if so, what does that mean for a future vision for arms control and disarmament?
So for future reference, taking questions from somebody who knows the subject better than I do, I would prefer not to. My sense, Heather, I was actually surprised when I was reading it at how robust the arms control parts of the nuclear posture review are, right? Like it points out that we won't sign the CTBT, but we will remain in compliance with much of what we've done, that we reserve the right to test if we should need to, but we don't see the need to do that, and it encourages all existing nuclear nuclear powers to sustain the no-testing moratorium, that it makes the SLBM, SLCM low yield. It emphasizes several different times that that's INF compliant. And when it talks about nuclear weapons use, it talks about doing it consistent with the laws of war and consistent with the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So this is a review that is much more constrained by treaties, by alliance obligations, by the sensibilities, not just of our allies, but a due respect for the opinion of mankind, as Jefferson would say, than I think any of us had any right to expect in a Trump administration, right? So yes, it's sharp-edged in some ways on how our adversaries have used time when we were not pressing aggressively forward. They have pressed aggressively forward. But it doesn't actually use the language of the U.S. being taken advantage of. Certainly not in the same bombastic terms that the president chooses to use that language. So I actually think one of the really reassuring things about this nuclear posture review is how much it does feel itself constrained, how much it does acknowledge the value to us of existing arms control, the way that it talks about incentivizing Russia returning to compliance, and how much it emphasizes, for example, that we met the February 2018 standard for New START implementation, and we want everyone else to be compliant with treaty obligation. I actually think this is a pretty positive story about arms control and where it fits in the U.S. defense enterprise. And none of us had any right to expect that in a Trump administration.
Can I ask you a follow-up question about that?
No.
I don't know why I asked. I'm going to do it anyway.
Don't have a choice, Matthew.
Sorry, boss. But so it does. This document does talk about the long-term goal of eliminating nuclear weapons and reaffirms it as a US goal. On the other hand, it does bracket it with the long-term goal of eliminating chemical and biological weapons. And what the report doesn't do is it doesn't link that goal to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It doesn't talk about Article 6 of the NPT. It doesn't really acknowledge a disarmament obligation arising from the NPT. So should we get ready for a very different approach on NPT issues than the Obama administration, do you think?
My guess is that a Trump administration will invest an awful lot less in the undertaking than the Obama administration did. For exactly the reasons that you outlined, Matthew, that they don't think, that they emphasize that American security guarantees have been the most effective non-proliferation tool. They don't think progress towards nuclear disarmament is occurring. I noticed it was a real grace note that the Nuclear Posture Review quoted Bill Perry, not only in talking about the fact that we're not making progress towards disarmament anytime soon, right? The current Secretary of Defense is hiding behind the former Secretary of Defense, a well-known disarmament advocate, in order to justify not making progress on this.
Thank you. Dana Allen.
Thanks, Dana Allen from the IISS. Kori, thank you very much for that. It's fascinating. Just a somewhat skeptical question on the idea of filling a gap in the escalation ladder. As you said, we've seen this movie before. You referred to flexible response. I think you referred to the INF debate. At the time of the INF debate, Leon Siegel, complained that basically we were getting bogged down in the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. The idea that there was a distinctly delineated escalation ladder and that the two sides were going to think about escalation and about their forces not in terms of their overall nuclear capabilities, but in terms of specific kinds of weapons, tailored, understood to have specific ranges, whereas, in fact, they had overwhelming nuclear destructive power on both sides. So here we are again. We're talking about the need for low-yield nuclear weapons. And I'm just maybe you could talk a little bit more about whether you really think that in a European crisis, in the Baltics, that American possession of these specific weapons would really be either calming to crisis dynamics or reassuring and sort of conducive to Allied solidarity, which I think would be the biggest fear in such a crisis.
Yeah, so your sad fate, Dana Allen, and the sad fate of everybody in this conversation is to have stumbled upon the subject of my PhD dissertation. So I wrote my PhD under Tom Schelling on the subject of flexible response and looking at the Berlin crises in 1958 and 1961. And Loris Norstad, who was the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe at that time, was profoundly critical of the Kennedy administration's desire to create more flexible options between apocalypse and conventional war. And in the 1960s, it really rattled NATO allies that the United States was willing to fight an extended conventional war in Europe without ever engaging our nuclear weapons, right? Raising the threshold was destabilizing at that time. Whether it would be destabilizing at this time, you would know better than I, but NATO keeps saying that ultimately the defense of our territory and our people relies on nuclear deterrence, making conventional war unimaginable for potential aggressors. So at some level, NATO allies still find that reassuring. The other really interesting and important point you raise is there a delicate balance of terror? Does it depend on 37 weapons rather than 38? Or on having these three varieties and every rung in Herman Kahn's ladder of escalation being dominated by us? And I don't know the answer to that, but I'd rather be right on the side of caution in that regard. My general view is that the nuclear balance, that the balance of terror is pretty robust and pretty stable. Like, I buy Loris Norstad's argument that in warfare, escalation is likely to be explosive, and we're very unlikely to have a war in Central Europe in which the two parties stumble into it rather than choose it as a fundamental test of our willingness to protect ourselves and our societies on the NATO part, or stumble into it because the Russians somehow misunderstand that we are going to do that. So I would rather have us err on the side of thinking Herman Kahn might be right than in being complacent and being wrong.
Okay. Desmond Bowen, who's in the second row.
Desmond Bowen, I'm a member here at IISS. Kori, thanks very much.
Yay, that's the very best category.
You talked about New START and compliance with New START on a couple of occasions, and indeed the kind of merits of staying within these arms control treaties. Can you say something about where the NPR sort of leads us, maybe, in thinking about NPR, which only has a few more years to go before it kind of expires, unless it's renewed? I mean, does this kind of reinforce the argument, not just for the United States, but above all for Russia, to continue compliance, or does it actually argue for some that breakout would be a better course?
I think it makes a very strong case for compliance on the part of the Russians in two ways. First, because it suggests considerable willingness to break out ourselves if the Russians don't remain in compliance of New START and return to compliance of the INF Treaty, of Open Skies, of CFE, of the Vienna Accord, right? It's quite exhaustive on the numbers of treaties the Russians are non-compliant with. I think sends a useful message that we don't consider ourselves bound by, we will not consider ourselves bound by treaties the Russians don't consider themselves bound by. The second way in which I think it is sends a useful message of Russian compliance is how clear it is about our compliance with the New START and why we see that in our interests. So the Nuclear Posture Review says we would like to be in negotiations with the Russians on reducing low-yield weapons. And it also makes clear that the Russians have not reduced those weapons, despite NATO's 90% reduction in its tactical nuclear weapons since the end of the Cold War, and despite an 85% reduction in that category of weapons by the United States. Right? And that we want to have that negotiation with the Russians. We want those reductions and limits in place, and the Russians don't. But it also says that it is not basing decisions on our forces on the likelihood of future arms reductions and limitation agreements with the Russians, because they're not in compliance with current ones, and we don't see any great willingness, the United States doesn't see any great willingness on the part of the Russians to enter into new arms control plans. So it puts the onus for the future of arms control squarely on the Russians, because we're willing and we're compliant, and we would like them to do both of those things.
The next question from the gentleman in the third row, two from the aisle.
Thank you. Norman Moss, I'm a member of the IISS. You spoke about the escalation ladder. I'm puzzled by the lower rungs of the escalation ladder. I mean, the B-1 bomb, which is the only nuclear weapon in the American nuclear weapon in Europe, is a natty little device, which is a variable yield. Now, the lower yield is 0.7 kilotons, which is in the high explosive range. Surely, in the lower ranges, in the sort of lower ranges of yields, we could use high explosives instead, and any tactical disadvantage or tactical advantage might be given by using nuclear weapons, which should be outweighed by the momentous step of breaking the nuclear taboo that's held since 1945. So what I'm saying is that the NPR and one or two other noises come out of Washington implies a greater willingness to use nuclear weapons and less respect for the nuclear threshold. Am I right?
No, I don't think you are, to be honest. I think what they are trying to do is prevent an enormous chasm between conventional war and nuclear war that an adversary might attempt to exploit to prevent us protecting ourselves and our allies. So I don't think they're trying to lower the nuclear threshold. The Secretary has said 27 times since the release of the document that they're not trying to lower the nuclear threshold. What they're trying to do is prevent any daylight between us fighting with conventional forces to protect our societies and us crossing the nuclear threshold, because they don't want an adversary to mistakenly believe that we will only do one and not the other.
Malcolm Chalmers in the second row in the middle.
Another question that should not have been taken.
Very warm welcome to London, Kori.
Thank you, my fellow deputy.
Join the Deputies Club. When you talked about this submarine-based cruise missile. You said that one of the advantages of that is it doesn't recreate the problem of the 1980s in relation to ground-based systems. And clearly there has been quite a bit of discussion over the last year in the context of Russian non-compliance with INF. If INF collapses over the coming years, shouldn't the United States have at least a development option in relation to ground-based medium-range missiles? Has this document put that option of ground-launched cruise or ballistic missiles, medium-range missiles, has it put it off the table now?
So Matthew, you are probably an even more careful reader of it than I, so correct me if I am mistaken. I don't think it forecloses it, but I didn't see it anywhere on the horizon line. My guess is that a better way to reinforce extended deterrence rather than deploying new weapons would be to broaden even further allied participation in the existing programs, and not just basing, but manning, security, NATO returning, for example, to its nuclear release exercises, so that defense ministers and military leaders think carefully about when and under what those circumstances we would make that terrifying decision. I think there are a lot of ways to send signals about the robustness and tight-knit nature of the NATO nuclear enterprise, and at least for me personally, new ground-based deployments would be very far down that list.
Kori, just to follow up on that question.
No.
My hearing's not very good. I think it says sea-launched cruise missile rather than submarine-launched cruise missile in the NPR.
Yes, you're right.
Do you think there's serious consideration being given to surface ship launched cruise missile, and not just? I mean, I think that I agree with you. I think the most likely one is submarine launch. But is a surface launched sea cruise missile being given serious thought?
So I honestly don't know the answer to that. My guess is that one of the criteria when it talks about development of the force towards the end of the nuclear posture review, it struck me that one of the criteria was visibility. So signaling in crisis by visibility of nuclear forces. So you may be right that a surface variant may be under consideration, but I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
Thanks. John Chipman.
John Chipman, IISS. First, many thanks for your warm prefatory comments and for your very eloquent and extemporaneous exposition of the US nuclear posture review. I had a question that links up to some of these over here, but in a different theater. There was a lot of talk about virtuous circles. How do countries react to US military postures? Has the United States been taken advantage of? What is the place of coupling in current extended nuclear deterrence relationships? So the question is, in the mid-1990s, the United States unilaterally withdrew tactical nuclear weapons from the Republic of Korea. Could you imagine circumstances where the United States would think of talking to the RAK about a redeployment of such tactical nuclear weapons to restore this coupling relationship, and also to ensure that it hadn't been taken advantage of by a bold DPRK?
Terrific question, boss. So a few points on that. First, 34 or so % of South Koreans would like to have American nuclear weapons redeployed on the Korean Peninsula or have South Korea develop its own. So the United States voluntarily denuclearized the Korean Peninsula in 1991 or 2. The Bush administration. So my sister's political party is not responsible for this one. But my political party thought that it would be stabilizing, and in fact, it proved that we've tested that proposition and it proved untrue on the Korean Peninsula. 34% of South Koreans would like to see the renuclearization of their half of the peninsula. There have been news reports on several occasions coincident with military-to-military talks between South Korea and the United States, that subject has come up in military channels. I also noticed that the Secretary of Defense has suggested that's not under consideration at this time. But if I were the North Koreans, I would be watching this space incredibly closely because they started this, and reestablishing parity on the Korean Peninsula can happen in one of two ways. It can happen with the North Koreans giving up their nuclear program, or the South Korean, American, and broader Asian alliance reestablishing parity on the nuclear peninsula. And we ought to be open about the fact that this is where North Korean behavior is driving South Korean attitudes and preferences, and America's strongest preference is about the continued protection of our South Korean allies.
Paulina, you have the next question. Third row in the middle.
Paulina Izo, it's IISS. If I can ask a question that goes a little beyond the particular topic of our conversation, and it's a little open-ended, for which I apologize. It just so happens that I'm reading Daniel Ellsberg's new book, Confessions of a Nuclear Planner. And just on the way to work this morning, I was reading a chapter about the Cuban Missile Crisis, that on several occasions, at least that's the perception of the author, and I think it's probably correct, that there was a gap in perception that what seemed unimaginable to U.S. planners, particularly in the nuclear realm, was actually considered and executed by the Soviets at the time. I wonder, could you say a bit more about do you see a danger in mirror imaging and assuming things in that particular realm? And if you do, is there a way to correct for it somehow?
Yes, and somewhat. So when I was working on my PhD dissertation, I went and interviewed the great William Kaufman, who had been the person on the Kennedy transition team that General Goodpaster took the U-2 photos to see, right? The Kennedy administration was campaigning on the missile gap, and the Soviets were, and as a result of the crises over Berlin, the U-2 overflights, Gary Powers' shoot down being the big news of that, the U-2 overflights were done in order to establish the nature and readiness of Soviet strategic forces. And so I was interviewing Bill Kaufman about that and asked for his impressions of it. And for those of you, as many IISS members will, because you're the nuclear priesthood of knowledge, as many will rightly guess, Bill Kaufman was outraged that the Soviets were doing such a bad job planning their nuclear forces at a time when the United States was wrapped around the axle thinking about permissive action links and how to ensure reliability, right? We were mirror imaging onto them much more care about the design and operation of their forces than they were. Which is a long way of saying, yes, of course, right? We are likely to misunderstand quite a lot. And the less we are culturally similar to and have lots of business and high school exchange student and normal journalist muckraking interaction in other societies, the likelier we are to be wrong about those things. That is to say, you should have a very wide margin of error for problems like North Korea, because we are going to be wrong about a lot of that stuff. And we ought to program into our policy being wrong about a lot of that stuff. Which takes me to your second question. Is there anything to do about that? Well, self-awareness is a good place to start, right? We should not expect that the message we think we are sending is the message that is being received. And that means we ought to be clear, consistent, and simple in the message we're trying to convey. We ought to have our friends and allies and even our adversaries reinforcing the clarity, simplicity, and continuity of our message. And we're not doing any of those things on North Korean policy.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're out of time. I have a lot of names on my list, and I apologise sincerely not to be able to get to them. This will not be your last opportunity to grill Kori on this stage. But for now, I hope you'll all join me in warmly thanking Kori for